Welcome, and thank you for joining us. You are in the webinar that we are hosting today about recent draft guidance from FDA on the topic of real-world data. My name is Susan Winkler, and I have the privilege of serving as the Chief Executive Officer of the Reagan-Udall Foundation for the FDA. The foundation exists solely to help FDA do more to protect and promote the public health, and we are pleased to have you join us today in our event to provide some of that support to the agency. We've got a little bit of housekeeping to cover before we get into the substance. I'll note we have over 1,000 folks registered for today's workshop, and we're so pleased that all of you could join us. For those who are not available to join us, there will be a recording from today's meeting, and the slides will be posted on the Foundation's website after the meeting. And for those of you who submitted questions as part of the registration process, we have those. And when we get to the Q&A section at the end of the webinar, I'll be raising as many of those as we can. Then a reminder, many of you know, but we want to underscore, the speakers today will not be discussing any specific regulatory actions or decisions. They will be describing the guidance and answering some of the questions that you've submitted beforehand. On the topic of discussion, we welcome your active engagement. Please submit questions and comments using the Zoom Q&A. We will monitor those and weave them into the conversation. We also encourage you to submit your comments and questions about the draft guidance to the Federal Register. The docket number is on a slide. I think if we go back one, the docket number is there. Nope, go forward one now. Back one. We'll get it right. There's one with a docket number on it. And so it has the docket number on it, and it's in the other meeting materials. We'll also put it in the chat so that you can find that more easily. I want to give you a brief overview of the agenda. And so if we could pull up the agenda slide with the timing, there we go. In just a moment, I'm going to turn over the microphone to Dr. John Kakado for some opening remarks. And then Dr. Scott Gordon and Dr. Masood Motamed will present an overview of the draft guidance. And then we will close with time for questions and answers with our team from FDA. So one more reminder for why we are all here today on the next slide. We are talking about FDA's recently released draft guidance on the topic of data standards for drug and biological product submissions containing real-world data. The agency wants to hear comments and questions from the public in today's session, as well as you submit those to the docket. So again, there are opportunities today and opportunities moving forward to submit comments on the guidance document. Now, I am going to step out of the way and allow our FDA speakers to take the stage. I'm going to introduce our first speaker, who is Dr. John Kakado. He serves as the Associate Director for Real World Evidence Analytics in the Office of Medical Policy in CDER at the US FDA. Dr. Kakado, it's our second webinar to talk about draft guidances. And so would you pick up the microphone and tell us about what folks should expect to hear and in today's discussion?
Thank you so much, Susan, and welcome everyone. As Susan mentioned, we're here today to discuss what we call our data standards guidance for short. And the next slide, please. For those who weren't able to attend the first webinar, this is the same slide that was shown last time. The 21st Century Cures Act can anchor our discussion. This slide actually brings the status of FDA's efforts up to date to late 2021, where we are now. FDA has established a program, as Congress wanted us to evaluate the potential use of real-world evidence to support a new indication for a drug already approved or to satisfy post-approval study requirements. It's important to mention that our standard for substantial evidence in this context remains unchanged, and we're not here today, but it is relevant to mention that there are Prescription Drug User Fee Act commitments that we have met along the way as well. Importantly, a draft framework was issued in December 2018, which described sources of real-world evidence. Oh, if we can go back one. Challenges, pilot opportunities, and more. And then, of course, we're here today because draft guidance has been issued EHR claims, today data standards, and in between the time that these slides were prepared and the time that we're giving the webinar, of course, for those who know, the registry's guidance for short was just released at the end of last month. So there'll be another webinar. But for today, next slide, please. The framework that I just mentioned, of course, is shown on the next slide. And I just wanted to remind everyone that this framework applies to the Center for Drugs and the Center for Biologics, but not to the Center for Devices or Veterinary Medicine, et cetera. And our program actually is multifaceted, including internal agency processes, external stakeholder engagement, and various demonstration projects, which we will not discuss today. Rather, we are here to discuss guidance development. And the next slide. Again, about guidance, this is the guidance agenda that is released at least once each year, indicating what FDA plans to publish in terms of guidance in the category of real-world data, real-world evidence. We see there are 4 guidances listed. The red arrow indicates the data standards document that we are here today to talk about. Let me go down and then circle back. The real-world data assessing electronic health records and medical claims we talked about in a prior webinar. And as I mentioned, the real-world data assessing registries to support regulatory decision-making was just released and will be the topic of a future webinar. And then going back up to the first bullet, there are considerations for the use of real-world data and real-world evidence to support regulatory decision-making guidance. And that shorthand is our regulatory considerations guidance, no surprise. And that will be coming out of the pipeline in due time. So I believe the next slide is a snapshot of the title page of the data standards guidance. It's self-evident that it's a draft guidance, and as a reminder, it was released at the end of October, and here we are in early December. So with that, I will pass the baton to my colleagues, Scott Gordon and Masoud Motammed.
Thanks, John. And we'll be ready. As you noted, we are going to move to the discussion and the description from Dr. Scott Gordon and Dr. Masoud Motammed. I'll just do a little bit on their titles and one note for you. So Dr. Scott Gordon is the Senior Health Informatics Officer in the Office of Strategic Programs at CDER. And Dr. Masoud Motammed is a Biology Reviewer in the Office of Tissue and Advanced Therapeutics in CBER. I will note that one thing that may be helpful in the presentation today is if you have the guidance in front of you, there's a link to the guidance in the chat. If it's not there yet, it is coming shortly. And throughout the presentation, you will see some snapshots of text from the guidance, along with the page number on where you can find it. So with that tip, I'm going to hand the microphone over to Scott and Masoud.
Thank you, Susan. Sound check, can you hear me okay?
All set.
Great, thank you. So we're going to split the rest of this talk where I'm going to do the first part, and then I'll hand this off to Dr. Motammed. So I'm Scott Gordon. I'm from the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research at FDA. So to start with, I'm going to say the obvious. The draft guidance we're discussing today is called Data Standards for Drug and Biological Product Submissions Containing Real-World Data. I mention this because in a moment, I'm going to actually spend a little time referencing other FDA guidances, which are important to understand for this talk. I'm going to do my best to be clear about when I'm talking about this guidance under discussion here or about other relevant guidance documents. It is relevant, so bear with me. Next slide, please. So quick agenda, background. First, I'll give you a background. It's kind of critical background to the legal and regulatory foundations for FDA being able to specify the data standards used for different types of information for a range of applications submitted to FDA. Then I'll walk through we'll walk through the selective key points of the draft guidance and try to summarize each bit. And then in the end, after we're done talking, we'll actually go to the question and answer session. Next slide. So what am I going to talk about? What are we going to talk about for the rest of these slides? It's 3 basic topics. How does FDA specify, study data standards requirements for submission, followed by some guidance on where real-world data fits into these requirements, and finally, some guidance on preparing study data obtained from real-world data sources for submission using the current study data standards for submission at FDA. So next slide, please. So first, I'm going to go into it's only a few slides, but a relatively dense bit of information about the legal and regulatory basis for data standards requirements at FDA. Next slide. Next slide, please. Go one back. Yes, thank you. So as I said, the draft guidance we're discussing today is what I'll now in short refer to as the real-world data standards guidance. But this guidance ultimately refers back to the legal foundation, which established FDA's ability to define what are acceptable data standards for use in submission of applications to FDA. A short summary of this legal basis found in Section 745A of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act is shown here. Without walking through each sentence, the bottom line is that FDA can specify data standards required for information that is submitted to FDA for the range of application types shown. Basically reading the list: NDAs, ANDAs, certain BLAs, and certain INDs. The process outlined by the legal framework is, in short, that FDA can release guidances establishing the specific electronic formats for information to submit it to FDA as part of these mentioned application types. Once these guidances take effect, following an established timeline, the applicable data standards referred to become the acceptable way to submit that information to FDA. Now, the next 2 slides we'll talk about the actual guidance documents and other documents that come out of this legal foundation. So this slide demonstrates, with some examples, the general hierarchy of guidance that now exists as first established in the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act. At the top is sort of the foundational FDA guidance that reflects the overarching processes that were described in the previous slide. This guidance, called Providing Regulatory Submissions in Electronic Format, submissions under Section 745AA of the FD&C Act, or for short, 745A guidance for now, is sort of the umbrella guidance under which everything else is covered. It generally delineates the process and timing of subsequent guidance that are put out to establish a data standard for a given type of information submitted in the cover type of applications. Below that are some examples of existing guidances which follow the process set out in the primary 745A guidance, each covering a different area of information submitted to FDA under those application types. So some examples of different information types can range from, for those that know what these are, the electronic common technical document, which is sort of the overall electronic wrapper for electronic submissions to FDA, IND safety reports, or as seen on the left, clinical and non-clinical study data. This guidance on the left, the full name, Providing Regulatory Submissions in Electronic Format, Standardized Study Data, which from now on I'll just call Electronic Study Data Guidance, is central to the guidance we're actually talking about today. This was published as final and has been in effect for several years now. And it's as I mentioned, it's the one that's the most pertinent to the draft guidance we're discussing today. So, reminder, this electronic study data guidance is not the guidance that you're all joining this talk for. That is the real world data standards guidance. But slowly you'll see how these two connect. So if we go to the next slide, just to finish this section, this is the final slide of an admittedly dense regulatory background, but it is important because these topics all come up in the real world data standards guidance. So this slide sort of shows how the guidance established under 745A, such as the electronic study data guidance, convey the detailed information regarding the data standards applicable for submission to FDA for different information applications. The top circle is essentially that overarching 745A guidance, again, an umbrella guidance. What's shown below it is that generally each guidance exists for a specific information type. In the case, once again, on the left, there's a guidance for clinical and non-clinical study data. In that guidance, there is first a reference to what is called the FDA Data Standards Catalog. This catalog is an active list found on fda.gov, which will let anyone know at any time exactly which data standards, including which versions of the standards and relevant implementation guides, are currently acceptable for specific types of information, such as study data. For each of these guidances, there's typically also an associated FDA published document called the Technical Conformance Guide, which gives clarity and details to the use of the specific data standards, with FDA's recommendations on how to actually use it in practice for a range of different needs that may arise in preparing an application. So overall, this establishes 4 main concepts, all of which come up to some extent in the actual text of the draft real-world data study guidance, real-world data standards guidance. First, the legal foundation for the ability to specify data standards. Second, a guidance document, specifically in this case, the electronic study data guidance, which establishes required data standards for clinical and non-clinical study data. The FDA Data Standards Catalog, which lists the standards currently acceptable for use and submission for a given type of information. And finally, a Technical Conformance Guide, which provides more details on how to use those standards. So I finished the regulatory background overview. So, and if you would like far more detail, you can reference the links when you have access to the slides provided here to see the relevant guidances and documents and all the supplemental information on fda.gov. With that done, I'll now move into the guidance that's the topic of today's talk, the real world data standards guidance. So next slide. And here I will now go through the guidance. So next slide. This is just to give you reference. Actually, Reagan-Udall Foundation has done some nice work making each slide give clear reference to where in the document, in the actual guidance document, we're talking as we go through this, but just to give you a sense of the order of things. Section 1, before I move forward, Section 1 of the guidance is mostly a preamble and background for why the guidance is being published, some of which Dr. Kankata already mentioned. So we're not really focusing on that aspect. So instead, I'm going to start with, next slide, please. I'll cover Section 2. So Section 2, in a nutshell, gives the regulatory background and central message of the draft real-world data standards guidance. Now, from here on going forward, this is just showing you the whole section. We'll use slides to walk through snapshots of the sections of text in the real-world data standards guidance and discuss the key points made by each of those bits of text. Next slide. So the beginning of Section 2 spells out exactly what I just spent some time describing previously. Specifically, through the previously mentioned electronic study data guidance, the FDA has specified the formats for the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research and the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, which these centers can accept for submission of clinical and non-clinical study data submitted as part of the application types specified previously. Next slide. This section continues on to state that, put very simply, real-world data that is submitted as part of study data in the covered application types is study data, and therefore subject to the electronic study data guidance. Next slide. So the final part of this section spells out that, as stated in the electronic study data guidance, you can find in the catalog, the data standards catalog, the currently acceptable data standards for submitting study data to the FDA, CDER and CBER, so Center for Drug Evaluation and Biological Evaluation and Research. As mentioned previously, those standards apply to all study data. And what you see at the bottom is sort of a paraphrase of the central message in this section of the draft real-world data guidance. After this, what follows in the real-world data guidance, the real-world data study standards guidance, is a deeper dive into the considerations raised by this central message. So next slide, please. So section 3A starts off with an understanding of the challenges in standardizing study data derived from real-world data sources, which this guidance is intended to help address. These considerations include differences in the variety of sources of real-world data and use of data standards in real-world data sources and systems, different terminologies, aggregation approaches, and even healthcare business and data practices. Next slide. Section 2B continues by expecting that because of this nature of real-world data, a variety of well-thought-out methods will be needed to effectively and reliably take any given set of real-world data and ultimately prepare the data that will be used to submit study data to FDA using the currently applicable data standards. Therefore, documentation of what was done from start to finish will be critical to allow FDA reviewers to understand and follow the decision-making process of how the data was converted from the real-world data source into this final standardized format for submission to FDA, as well as to understand the actual end-to-end processes performed upon the data to do this. So next slide. So section 2C begins first with an important preamble sentence, which states that over time, we do plan to issue further guidance and or updates of the standards in the data standards catalog. Until that time, next slide, please. The study data standards listed in the data standards catalog. No, yeah, go back up. Yes. The study data standards listed in the data standards catalog, following the relevant technical conformance guides, are the only ones currently accepted by FDA. And this reiterates the central point in section 2. Now, as an aside, it's not said here, if you go right now and look, as of December 3rd, 2021, if you go look for clinical study data and you go to the data standards catalog to look up the applicable data standards, you'll see these currently include the study data tabulation model, SDTM, and the analysis data model, ADAM, which are managed by the Standards Development Organization, CDISC, Clinical Data Interchange Standards Consortium. So just as a reference of what's true today. So next slide, please. So this section continues the train of thought by asking sponsors to consider what is needed to make real-world data conform ultimately to the existing data standards requirements. Then, in the next slide, it follows by highly encouraging sponsors to discuss these approaches early with the appropriate FDA review divisions. And then, next slide. It ends with the recommendation for sponsors to document all work as completely as possible to make it clear how they navigated from the real-world data sources to the accepted data standards for submission. Again, this is asked so as to allow FDA reviewers to understand and follow the decision-making process, as well as to understand the actual end-to-end machinations that were performed upon the data. Next slide. So the final two subsections of section 3 take a slightly deeper dive to discuss a few of these concepts just a bit more. So in section 3D, we offer considerations. So first, around the conceptual mapping of real-world data to the applicable study data standards for submission. So when we're saying mapping in this case, we're talking about the decision-making involved in determining how elements of information from real-world data can ultimately be represented in the applicable study data standards. We provide examples for mapping concepts where concepts between healthcare and regulatory research are not identical, and there are certainly many, such as vitals, medication, ethnicity, and so on. Next slide. So, and regarding this conceptual mapping of real-world data to study data standards, this section reiterates the importance of documenting whatever choices are made in mapping concepts between real-world data and the current applicable study data standards. Here we suggest that much of the narrative aspects of this be put in what's called the Study Data Reviewer's Guide. And in the context of the current electronic common technical document and the study data standards themselves, we suggest that the technical data details of these mappings are best put in what's called the define XML file, which is foundational for studies in the currently accepted study data standards. So it's just a distinction of where to put sort of the narrative and explanatory aspects as opposed to the very hard nuts and bolts of the mappings and things of that nature. Next slide. Section 3E, it's a similar section. In this case, we're offering considerations around actually achieving the ultimate transformation based on the rationales implied in the previous subsection, mapping and other decisions of that sort, of real-world data to the applicable study data standards for submission. So examples of this are given, including inherent differences in terminology, such as units of measures and coding systems, as well as varying data collection practices at healthcare sites, and so on. So next slide. And so similarly, to the previous subsection regarding transformations of real-world data to study data standards, this section again reiterates the importance of documenting the choices made in transforming from start to finish these data, the data from real-world data from the source to the final study data standards. And again, we suggest that the narrative aspects be put in the Study Data Reviewer's Guide and the technical aspects be put in the Define XML. So this ends my part of the talk, and which is discussing the main points being made in the draft real-world data guidance. And I'm going to now hand this over to Dr. Motamed from the FDA Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research to discuss the appendix in which we, sort of for illustrative purpose, provide some examples of how you might use the currently applicable standards for study data. So over to you, Masood.
Thank you. Good day, everyone. As discussed by Dr. Gordon, I'll discuss the appendix of the current draft guidance. The appendix really serves as an illustration or example of the manner that the mapping of healthcare data into a standardized format may be achieved. To takeaways that are going to be key is these are just illustrations or examples, and this is purely for assistance with regards to understanding the thought process that we currently maintain. So with that understood, the next slide will go ahead and delve a bit deeper into one of the examples presented in the draft guidance. For the purpose of this talk, we chose to present the first illustration or example provided in the draft guidance because we feel it's more ubiquitously understood, and it will as well illustrate just as well as the other illustration provided in draft guidance. In this case, we understand there may be heterogeneity between the way a healthcare system collects race and ethnicity data versus what is provided in terms of standardized study data. Specifically, FDA retains the guidance collection of race and ethnicity data in clinical trials, where a minimum of 5 specific categories is defines race. Those are number 1, American Indian or Alaska Native, 2, Asian, etc. We're aware that many healthcare or real-world data sources may not contain the same codified terms, and given that, we suggest that, as Dr. Gordon explained, in the defined XML, the decode or alias elements may be utilized to enable traceability of decision-making to convert the various nomenclatures from a healthcare source into standardized format. And that's depicted in this next slide. On the right-hand side of this table, you'll see a display value or decode value. That is essentially the input data with regards to the study data or the real-world data being utilized as study data. The left or permitted code is the standardized way the data is presented. Just for reference and to give an example of how this may be applicable, under the permitted code, the permitted value code, you can see the code for Asian. I'm not going to read the specific code, but you towards the right-hand side of the table, you see it may have been received from a healthcare setting in terms of ethnicity as Chinese, or it may have retained the Asian categorization consistent with the standardized format. Either way, by utilizing this decode element, both designations can then be codified to the permitted Asian code. This is important because it allows the healthcare data to be standardized, as well as gives FDA an insight into decision-making a sponsor may have used to facilitate conversion of the real-world data into standardized format. Next slide, please. Nevertheless, we know there's more than one approach that may be utilized to convert real-world data into standardized format. The easiest way to visualize this is the data may be translated into the codes and then mapped, or all the original codes may be mapped to least granular analogous codes. Either way, the sponsor needs to determine which is the best approach for their given study, while ensuring that there is traceability of the data, as Dr. Gordon mentioned. Nevertheless, FDA expects that the application of decode in may be a mechanism for allowing such, as provided an illustration. Next slide, please. So at this point, we're going to sort of summarize what we talked about. Dr. Gordon kindly introduced how FDA specifies the expected study data standards. Specifically, he noted it must be used for submission of study data. The requirements come from this FD&C Act, specifically 745AA of the FD&C Act. And the current allowable study data standards are all listed in the data standards catalog. And along with the slides will be hyperlinks to the relevant resources. Next slide, please. So in terms of where real-world data fits in with these requirements, we recognize that there are challenges, as many of the study data standards mentioned by Dr. Gordon are not necessarily optimized for healthcare data. Nevertheless, we have the catalog, which can be updated through a formal mechanism to expand resources as they become relevant or applicable. Until then, the current standards specified in the catalog should be referenced and are required under 745A of the FD&C Act. Next slide. So this cannot be emphasized enough, but there's really no one-size-fits-all approach, as there's a great heterogeneity amongst healthcare data. And we anticipate various uses of healthcare data for submission as study data. Sponsors should therefore discuss as early as possible with FDA their anticipated approach. As said previously, all data transformations, mappings, et cetera, should be documented. It is essential that FDA can discern what the input data was from and what the output data that we're reviewing is. Examples provided in the appendix of the draft guidance are illustrations, or for illustration purposes. Next slide, please. So the real take home is this draft guidance just emphasizes that real-world database submissions are submissions of study data, and therefore the current applicable standards apply. We understand there's heterogeneity amongst healthcare data, so talk to FDA early and to facilitate submission, and document. It is important that FDA understands the data and understands any logic or thought processes that go into standardizing such data. Next slide. This is just an acknowledgement. Many offices and centers were involved in arriving at this draft guidance, and we appreciate your time and attention.
Masood and Scott, thank you for taking us through the explanation and providing some highlights and underscoring key components of the guidance. That was very helpful. And Masood, I might even kind of paraphrase your take-home messages there. It seems like there's a recurring theme of intentionality, right? So being intentional in the data standards translation, communication with the agency early and often, and then documentation, as you said, document, document, document. So thank you for walking us through that. And now it is time to go to our question and answer session. So I'm going to invite our FDA speakers back to the stage so that we can go into our questions. So Doctors Concado, Gordon, and Motamed, if you would come back here, we've got quite a few questions to go through, and we'll see how many we can make it through. The first one, I think, Scott, this might best go to you. And I'll pull some of these together. There are several questions that are related to timing and whether current standards are applicable to study data derived from real-world data sources right now. And one of them gave us an example. In the data standards catalog, the supported data standards listed for clinical study data are CDISC's study data tabulation model and the analysis data model. Does that mean that these current acceptable data standards for clinical study data apply to study data derived from real-world data sources at this time? Or does the standard take effect at some later time to be announced? Help us with some of that alignment on timing.
Right, and it takes a few rounds, even as I tried to navigate the whole thing in the early part of the talk. So first, a reminder that the guidance, which I simplified as calling the electronic study data guidance, establishes these data standards requirements for all study data contained in submissions, which are subject to 745A of the FD&C Act, with the applicable application types as mentioned before. So the guidance we're discussing here today basically clarifies that study data derived from real-world data sources are still study data, and therefore they are subject to the electronic study data guidance. And so, yes, the current study data standards apply. The catalog, just to be clear that we are thinking forward, is designed so that new versions of existing standards or even new standards can be added in the future to better support data needs. The timeline for that process is actually described to reasonable extent in the both the overarching umbrella 745AA guidance and the electronic study data guidance, specifically for study data, which we've mentioned a lot. So you can get more understanding of the general timelines of things and how things would flow both for new versions of existing standards or new standards. But for now, again, the standards listed in the catalog, as we mentioned, the SDTM and ADAM, are specified as applicable, and so they apply to all study data, including study data derived from real-world data contained in submissions, which are subject to 745AA.
Got it. So yes, right, building from the prior, and then this is clarifying and how that aligns. Super helpful. Thanks, Scott. Our next question is about data standards applying to different therapeutic areas. And so I think here it's just underscoring, do these data standards apply to different therapeutic areas? Are they applicable to both efficacy and safety studies? Masood, help us a little bit with kind of how big is the box of applicability for these data standards in therapeutic areas?
Certainly. The data standards are not dependent on the therapeutic area or whether or not they're intended to support safety or efficacy. Rather, they apply to all clinical and non-clinical data found in applications covered under 745A of the FD&C Act. The best place to reference is the electronic study data guidance. And I believe that Dr. Gordon provided a wonderful overview of these guidances. And he delineated the applications covered under 745AA of the FD&C Act. So in summation, the standards are applicable to different therapeutic areas in data to support both safety and efficacy.
Great. So it's more about the application? Is it a new drug application, an ANDA, certain biologics license applications, and INDs, and not the therapeutic area? Okay, so now we've got our box of applicability as it relates to therapeutic areas. Let me pull up the next one, focuses on the discussion of study data derived from real-world data sources. Does FDA see more promise in some data sources versus others for generating study data? I know that you don't have favorites within data sources, or maybe I shouldn't say that. John, what's kind of the thought on different types of data sources?
Thanks, Susan. I'm smiling because you just drew a very nice box, and we're going outside of the box with this question, but that's fine. That's what we're here for. So I might first start by emphasizing what you all heard, which is that Scott and Masoud really talked about what I refer to informally as the technical aspects, right, of submitting real-world data, 745A on down. So again, going back to other guidances, in this case, the EHR claims, the subject topic of a prior webinar, and the registry's guidance, the topic of a future webinar, those could be joined under the umbrella of types of real-world data sources, right? And those guidances provide recommendations, responses when considering the suitability of the real-world data sources for drug development. So those might be called the methodologic aspects, informally, unofficially, if today we're talking about the so-called technical aspects. So again, with the caveat that we're going beyond the data standards guidance, here we're aligned with our 2018 framework for CDER and CBER, where we talk about sponsors should really take their time to assess whether and how the real-world data sources are fit for purpose, fit for use. We know that's a general phrase, but that translates into using good scientific, methodologic, epidemiologic, fill-in-the-blank judgment in terms of how well the data source addresses the research question in terms of the data being reliable, of course, but also relevant, and make that case clearly to the agency. So, sorry, I'm answering your question, I guess, most succinctly at the end. Correct, FDA does not endorse one data source over another, given that one data source actually may address a specific research question very, very well. And if we were inclined, or we're not giving that data source an A+ on their report card or a good housekeeping seal of approval, and the reason we're not is that for a different research question, that same data source might be on the poorly suited end of the spectrum. So, you know, we will use our best judgment, and we will be consistent across different areas, but at the end of the day, it does have to be a case-by-case assessment for the reasons I just stated. So thank you.
Great, thanks, John. And I promise, I think this next question takes us back inside the box of the,
all good.
Data standards guidance. That's all right. So, well, so to get back inside the box, how this will be challenging though. So I should say back in the box, but still challenging. How exactly can real-world data be standardized for submissions? I think this one might be good to go to a couple of panelists. So Scott, do you want to take a swing at that one?
Sure. Well, and I think this is alluded to in the draft guidance itself. I mean, we can't give one answer. I think anybody who knows the research, everything around real-world data, should not be surprised at this. Cannot give one answer that applies to all situations. We're actually linking to what John just mentioned. But you know, we understand that making real-world data work with making real-world data work at all, and certainly working with our existing submission standards will be challenging. Although no one-size-fits-all approach is available, one day maybe, but that's not now. There certainly are a range of potential ways to utilize these current standards that will be able to, depending on the source and the research need, that will be able to be used to comply with the currently allowable formats. In the guidance, we give some basic suggestions, again, illustrative, and about how and where to document the approaches taken. And again, as pointed out previously, depending on the data being used and the study performed, it's just likely there's going to be different approaches that can work for each given case. So this is the main, this is one strong reason we suggest engaging with FDA and the relevant divisions as early as possible to discuss potential approaches and the appropriate documentation needed for any sponsor-specific study needs and their choice of real-world data. That's sort of my thought on it.
That's I think helpful in kind of help, you know, with the can't do it exactly, but then have the conversation. Masood, do you want to jump in there?
Sure. Essentially, the draft guidance specifies that currently applicable study data standards are as applicable to data derived from real-world data when they're submitted as part of an NDA, ANDA, certain BLAs, and certain INDs. The ones that basically applications under 745AA. The appendix of the draft guidance, it was drafted to allow us to demonstrate how the decision making how decision making can be communicated in terms of converting real world data into these standardized formats that are applicable to 745AA based submissions. Besides the rationale, the decision making should be placed in a manner to where FDA can understand and trace the data from source to submission. And as Dr. Gordon noted, any narrative could be provided in a reviewer's guide, but what's important is that FDA is able to trace the data.
Really helpful, so that it's understanding, say, when you can't give the exact approach, but document what you do so that the agency can see the decision-making process and how you got there. Is that fair?
Yes.
Great. So let's do, I think we have time for a couple more questions. This one comes back to timing. The draft guidance mentions further guidance and or updates to the data catalog for real-world data. Anyone want to comment on the expected timeline when other data standards will be added to the catalog? And I'll note, it's not fair to ask regulators for precise dates. So I think this is more general. Help us with the catalog in timing there. Masood, do you want to jump in on that one?
Sure. The electronic study data guidance, it was the one highlighted in green in Dr. Gordon's presentation, describes the approach for addition of items to the catalog in terms of updated versions of existing study data standards or addition of new study data standards. FDA may announce future availability of new standards and or versions to existing standards via a federal registrar's notice. In the electronic study data guidance, specifically section 2.E.2, it specifies that when will electronic submission of standardized study data be required? Version updates to FDA supported standards, which describes the timeline to announce new or updated versions of study data standards, as well as the communication mechanism. Versions updates won't be effective till at least 12 months after the next calendar date, March 15th date, essentially from notice 1 March 15th thereafter, it won't be effective. And new standards will be added 24 months from the next calendar, March 15th date following publication of the Federal Registrar notice. So the great thing is, well, we can't say specifically what standards will come from in the future, and that can be elaborated. The electronic study data guidance does specify a specific time frame by which new or updated versions of standards will be applicable.
Great. Yep, okay. Go ahead, Scott, jump in.
Yeah, and so, yeah, that's exactly, so this is the simple answer that we can say, because it's there in our guidance that says, all of our guidances that says how it's going to happen, how it will happen. Obviously, we can't say what we're thinking, what versions, what standards, all of that. But there is a method of communication through the appropriate regulatory channels and a timeline. But I did want to note, and people who are active in the community know this, FDA remains very active in participation with many standards development organizations and even common data model initiatives, such as Odyssey, for those that know it, CDISC, of course, HL7, as well as in many public work groups, public workshops, and public meetings, all around real world data and real world evidence. So we're not doing this, whatever our thinking is, it's not happening in a vacuum. We're not doing it in isolation. So I just wanted to make that clear. We can't say what we're thinking until we publish it or whatever, but we're listening to a lot.
Excellent. And then there's time to react and implement, which is helpful. We are really in just the last few minutes of the webinar. So I'm going to take a swing at one question that we saw that came through that I think you've answered a couple times, and it had to do with how sponsors can ensure that their approach to data transformation is acceptable to FDA. And I think I've heard each of you say there are a number of different ways. So you need to come up with an approach and talk to FDA. Could I get head nods on that? Is that a fair way to answer that question? Great. I'm going to close out with one last question. This is about our box of what the guidance covers or doesn't cover as far as applications. John, does this guidance cover veterinary applications or devices?
Well, that's a very basic question, but therefore it's a very good question and a good one to end on. As we know, FDA has multiple centers, each with oversight over specific areas that relate to the agency's overall mission. And as was mentioned, the guidance we're discussing today applies to the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research and the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research. But no, the answer is it does not apply to devices or to veterinary. But the good news is that both of those centers, the Centers for Device and Radiologic Health, as well as for veterinary medicine, indeed have their RWE guidance and are also engaged, as Scott just said, a very important point about being engaged with stakeholders. So it is a lot to cover, but I think the good news is that if stakeholders have a question, they could be reasonably confident that with the guidances that are available and more that's coming, we will provide FDA's recommendations for what they should consider in this context.
Fabulous. A great point.
I'm sorry, one last point. I know we've been throwing a lot of guidances around, but I didn't think to have the URL ready. But if one searches for the search for FDA guidance documents, that's literally the name of a page. Google will be very, very user-friendly in terms of finding any guidances. If you have any problems, give us a shout, an email, and we'll help as well.
Absolutely. That's a great tip, John. Thank you. That takes us, we're in the final minute of our webinar. So I want to first thank our speakers. Thank you for walking us through the guidance and answering a number of the questions that came in today. I'll remind all of you who have joined us on the webinar to please submit your comments and questions about the draft guidance to the docket. There's more information on the event page on our foundation website. And then I'll note that we are looking forward to a third webinar in this series to talk about FDA issued draft guidances on real world evidence. And in particular, we'll be discussing the most recent one on assessing registries to support regulatory decision making in the future. So thank you, everyone. Really appreciate the audience engagement and the time that each of you has invested in today's program. Take care, and we will see you soon.